Okay, welcome to another Hope Cunningham Environmental Lecture. I am Colin Oriens, the Director of Environmental Studies. So pleased to see so many of you here again. It seems like you planned it perfectly. There seems to be one person per chair, so we don't have to play musical chairs today. I do want to remind people there are some nice stairs to sit in. If you want to, if someone comes in late, you could guide them to the stairs. I think that I just went up the Anderson stairs and there was a student at every step, it seemed like. So I know you're used to it. So usually we start today with an opportunity for announcements from the room to see if anybody has things that they would like to let the community know about. And I know that there are a couple today, and I don't know exactly who's going to give them. So raise your hand if you have an announcement.
I think we're the same one. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hi. So Elliot and I are from Sunrise, and we are partnering with I think it's over 15 other student organizations, 17 student organizations, to bring people to the global youth climate strikes tomorrow. So if you haven't heard, the youth climate strikes are going to be this massive, one of the largest youth mobilizations of our lifetime thus far. It's going to be, there are like strikes happening in over 200 different countries on every single continent. Students are striking from classes, and workers are striking from their jobs to demand that our politicians address the climate crisis swiftly and boldly. It's going to be this really, really powerful historical day. I encourage all of you to, if you can, like drop whatever you're doing and come, because it's going to be so powerful. We are organizing a rally at Tufts at 10:15 tomorrow morning outside the lower campus center, where we're going to hear some speeches and stories and songs from members of the Tufts community. And then we're going to march to Davis. There are going to be hundreds of students there. We're going to march to Davis, and then we're going to take the T to the main rally. We're going to fill the T. 3 T's. Yeah, and we're going to head to the main rally, which is at Boston City Hall Plaza. We're expecting in Boston there are going to be over 10,000 people there. It was all organized by high schoolers, which is pretty incredible. It's going to be like a really, really powerful day, and I encourage you all to take part in this historical day of striking. And please feel free to talk to either one of us if you have questions. Yeah. So pumped.
So I'm really excited that you're doing this. It's a great move. Jordan is also excited you're doing that, but he's super happy it's not today, because he likes the fact that you're all here to hear what he's saying. So, was there another announcement?
I do. I have an announcement. I think I mentioned this last week, but every year we have an environmental lunch here at Tufts, where all the departments, programs, centers, and student groups doing anything about the environment get together over food. It's happening on Tuesday in Barnum Hall at 12 o'clock. So please be there so you can hear more about Tufts Sunrise, which I just heard they had over 100 people for their first GIM this week. So come to learn about us and to meet us next week, Tuesday.
Any other announcements? Okay, well, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jordan Karubian. I've known him for a number of years now, and what really inspires me about him is his work both in sort of the basic sciences, but his real commitment to think about the implications of his work and to actually work to sort of increase his impact in the field of conservation. He has 3 field sites. These will all make you cry. He has to work in Australia, and he has to work in Ecuador, and then he gets to work along the coast of Louisiana doing some really interesting bird research in that area. So he has a really large research group that are all trying to do both basic research and conservation research. His funding has been, get a load of this, Disney Foundation is like really psyched about the work that he does in conservation. He gets money from the Fish and Wildlife Service. He gets money from the National Science Foundation. He started his own nonprofit with some colleagues in Ecuador to sort of really think about ways in which we can do civic engagement as we're doing our work. And so I couldn't be more pleased to welcome Jordan Karubian to Tufts. Thank you for coming up from Tulane.
Thanks, Colin. Well, thanks so much, Colin, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm sure that if the pizza was in a different room and I was in this room, you'd all be here watching me talk instead of the pizza. So it's, yeah, so as Colin said, I want to give you guys a little bit of an overview about some community-engaged research that we've been doing in Ecuador. And then tomorrow, I'll be giving a departmental seminar for the biology department where I'll dig in a little bit more to sort of the research and sciencey side of it. But this is a little bit more having to do with the civic engagement and real-world impacts. And I want to start by posing a question. Let's see here. I got it. Okay. So the question that I want to pose to you is, what is the role of the university in contemporary society? All of us, in one form or another, are associated or affiliated with a university. I'm a professor. Many of you are probably students. Oh, thank you. So, you know, there's sort of a traditional perspective of the university as the quote-unquote the ivory tower, a place where knowledge is generated and disseminated. Knowledge is generated by researchers for knowledge's sake. Thank you very much. But what I want to pose is that you can also envision the university as a place where real-world issues are dealt with in a meaningful way, so that not just, you know, going beyond just publishing results in peer-reviewed journals and erudite scientific meetings, and actually moving out into the real world to solve some real-world issues. And for me personally, two issues that I'm really concerned about and passionate about are, you know, the human population that we have on the planet today, which is north of 7 billion and continuing to increase, and then the environmental impacts that are associated with having so many people in a planet with finite resources. So what I want to do is give an overview of the community engagement. Was not expecting that. Let's see what's happening here. Talk amongst yourselves for a moment. I'm going to wait till this gets set back up. Not good. Do you think it was that? No.
No. The projector had an auto off function. I have. This room is all sorts of freaked out.
Yeah. Okay.
You should be back.
All right. Okay, everybody, we're back. Okay, so as I was saying, community engaged research. So my general approach, I've been a faculty member for about 10 years now, and this has been something that sort of evolved for me over time, but I want to talk with you a little bit about my general approach as a faculty member, and then get into a little bit more details about what it is that we actually do. So my general approach is, my goal professionally is to identify and to develop synergies between traditional scholarship, so sort of the generation of basic knowledge, and then, the needs of local communities in the areas where we work. And I have a few assumptions that I just want to make clear to everybody, and I'd be happy to talk about these later on. One is that oftentimes we hear about applied research and basic research as if they're different things. And I want to make the case that there need not be any distinction between those two. That yes, sure, there's some times when research is, more clearly on one end of the spectrum than the other, but that in general, thinking about those as sort of alternative endpoints or approaches to science is not necessarily a useful approach. I also think, speaking personally, that academics can and should seek to contribute to the common good, the same way that every sort of citizen in a civil society should. And third of all, I feel like by tapping into local knowledge in the areas where we work, whether that's here, a few blocks away from the university, or whether it's on the other side of the world, can actually improve the nature of the scholarship that we do. So my objectives here, personal and professional objectives, are to protect the environment and improve livelihoods, and also to enhance the quality, breadth, and impact of the research that I do. That's what I'm all about. And I want to talk to you guys about some work that I've been doing for many years now in South America in an area called the Chocó Biogeographic Zone. So the Chocó, as you can see here, is an area that extends from southern Panama down to northern Ecuador. So it passes through Colombia and into northern Ecuador, and it's kind of sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Andes mountain range on the other side. So it's this narrow, thin band of research. On the other side of the Andes is the Amazon. Okay, so it's different from the Amazon. All of you have heard about the Amazon, but I'm just curious, how many of you have actually heard of the Chocó coming into here? Okay, great. That's actually about, somewhere between 5 and 10%, which is actually a pretty high proportion. So I'm glad to see you guys are getting well informed, and I hope that coming out of this, you'll have even more information, all y'all. So the Chocó is notable for a number of reasons, one of which is that it gets over 8 meters of rain a year, which is a lot of rain. As a reference point, in the Amazon basin, most sites there get about 3 meters of rain a year. So we're talking about 2.5, 3 times more rain than the Amazon. It's very wet. And it's a global conservation priority. And I just put a few indices up here, but it has the highest diversity of palm trees in the Americas. It has more endemic bird species than anywhere else in the Americas. An endemic species is one that's found in one place and one place only. So that combination of high endemism and high diversity has, some real implications for conservation. A lot of species, and many of them are found nowhere else. But it also has really high rates of deforestation and species loss. And there's a study that was done, well, actually, no, I'm not going to get into that right now. What I am going to do is show you guys where we work in western Ecuador. So this is Colombia up here and the Pacific Ocean over here. And the stippled areas of this map show forest cover as estimated in 1938, 1958, 1988. And sadly, if we continue forward to the current period, this trend has continued. The area has been absolutely hammered by deforestation. And there's a study that was published in the late 90s suggesting that less than 5% of the original forest cover in this area is still standing. So for this combination of reasons, the exceptional diversity and endemism and threat, this really should be considered one of the global conservation priorities. And the specific area where I've been working for a while is called the Machichindul Reserve, which is shown here on this red map in northwestern Ecuador. So it's an interesting area because it sort of is a gradation zone from the very humid Chocó biogeographic zone to the north, and then the more arid Tumbasian biogeographic zone to the south, which is also a real center for diversity and endemism and threat. And the Machichindool Reserve is what's known in some places as a classic sort of paper park. If you look and see what it says in terms of the actual legislation that established the park, it's considered an absolute reserve, which means that for a human to even set foot in this area, you need to have written permission from the government. But that completely ignored the fact that at the time that it was established, there were several thousand people already living inside the borders of the park. So there's a complete disconnect between what it says on paper and what the reality is. And the management of this park has been a real issue moving forward since it was established in the early 90s. As an example, a recent study came out showing that from 2000 to 2008, 10% of the existing forest cover within the reserve was cut. And that's within the federal reserve. Outside the reserve, conditions are even worse. So, there's ongoing deforestation in this area. And I thought I'd just show you a few pictures to make this a little bit real to you guys. So here's some pictures of, some of the animals that if you were to go on a walk in the Machichindool Reserve, you might expect to see or encounter. And here's pictures of many of the species that are endemic to this area. So these are species that are found in this area and nowhere else. Here are some of the threats that you can see in the area. There's widespread deforestation and also hunting, which are both driving down populations of the species there. And one key point that I want to make that's really informed my whole approach to working in this area is that when we sit here in the United States and we think about deforestation, we think about species loss, the fires in the Amazon, oftentimes our mind goes to, large multinational corporations that are coming in and raping the environment or something like that. That's not the case in this area. It's true that, timber concessions came in and opened up access in the first place 50 or 60 years ago. But today, what's happening and what's driving contemporary patterns of deforestation and species loss is really driven by the local residents. People who, in many cases, are just trying to put food on their tables, but they lack viable alternatives to do so. So the one thing that was a real realization for me going down to Ecuador was, and this is something that took a little bit of time to evolve for me, is that these are not bad people. They're not evil people. They're not trying to destroy their own environments. Rather, they find themselves in a situation where they lack, in some cases, education and knowledge about the consequences of their actions. But even more so, they lack viable alternatives. So I moved down to Ecuador after getting my PhD in 2001. And I lived there full-time for 6 years. And when I went down there, I sort of had carte blanche. I had a very open-ended sort of mission, which was to try to find some sort of bridge between academic research and on-the-ground conservation implications. And that could have taken a lot of different forms. I was able to travel all around the country. And I really fell in love with both the people and the environment in this area. And this is where I ended up spending a lot of my time and working. And there was sort of an evolution of my process down there, starting out as just sort of straight-up research on endangered species. I thought I would gather information about them, and that somehow through doing that, I would be able to achieve meaningful conservation. But after a little bit of time down there, it became very clear to me that alone, research alone, was not going to cut it, that there needed to be a significant sort of interaction and engagement with the local community members. And the reason why is that in an area like this, where there's very little enforcement of any sort of environmental regulations that may exist, it's really the attitudes and the actions of the local residents that are going to determine the way that the conservation trajectory plays out in this area. And this area is not unique in that sense. I think almost anywhere, even here in the northeast of the United States, it's ultimately the attitudes and the actions of the local people that are going to determine the way things play out. So that, for me, was sort of a realization that really triggered and motivated a real commitment to engagement. And what I'm going to do now is kind of give you guys an overview of the approach that we ended up taking and what some of the, what some of the wins and some of the challenges have been in that context. So the model that we've developed for community-engaged research, it rests on twin pillars, which is scientific research and community engagement. And there's four sort of integrated and synergistic components to the project that we have. One is the research itself, and I'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. The research serves as a vehicle for training local residents and also for providing full-time employment for local residents. So it does provide a viable alternative to things like deforestation or hunting. The research and the training together combine for an effective sort of local education project with local residents who are working on the projects really being the advocates and sort of ambassadors for the educational messages that we want to convey to local residents. And then also, working with the communities, sharing information with them in sort of an iterative process. We get feedback on what viable alternatives might be, what there's interest in pursuing, and then we work to try to promote those alternatives. And then we study the efficacy of those approaches. So that's sort of an overview of the approach that we have. And the vehicle that we use to implement this project is an NGO that we started. It's an Ecuadorian NGO, which is called FCAT. And FCAT stands for Foundation for the Conservation of the Tropical Andes in Spanish. So like I mentioned before, I started working there in 2001. And after a year or so, I started working pretty intensively with local residents. And for many years, we sort of operated under the radar, so to speak, without a formal, legally recognized entity in Ecuador. But starting in almost 8 years ago now, 8 years ago, we actually founded a legally recognized NGO. And the NGO is composed primarily of local residents, people who were born and grew up in this area. But there's also a cadre of international scientists, myself, other students who've done their PhD with me, and some other scientists. There's about 2 local residents for every 1 scientist that we have. And our mission is to provide local residents with the information and capacity that they need to ensure wise stewardship of the natural resources in this area. So as I mentioned before, and just to talk about in a little bit more detail, the research that we conduct there can really be seen as a vehicle to address real-world problems. And the way that that plays out is as a source of providing training and employment for local residents, providing scientific expertise and information to address local environmental issues, a vehicle for sharing information with stakeholders to try to come up with informed management plans for the future. And then finally, more recently, a vehicle to identify, conserve, and to connect priority habitat, and hand in hand with that, to try to advance reforestation, ecotourism, and additional land purchase for conservation. Okay, so let me give a little bit of an overview about how this all works. So the NGO that we have is we have 7 founding members who are basically all local residents plus myself. And right now we have, depending on when you catch us, somewhere between 5 and 10 full-time employees. Like I mentioned before, the foundation is composed of local residents, professionals, and US-based scientists. So I'm a professor at Tulane University. I have a lab with several graduate students, and many of my graduate students end up doing their PhD research. And similarly, undergraduate honors thesis students and master's students end up doing their research in the context of this project, working very closely with the local residents that we work with. We have an operating budget that's about, depending on the year again, between $100,000 and $200,000 a year, so not huge and not tiny either. We have almost no overhead costs. We don't even have an office really in Ecuador. And we have, most of the funding that we get for this project is on the back of grants. The Disney Foundation, like Colin mentioned, has been a long-term and trustworthy funding source for us. Sometimes we get funding for more on the basic science side of things from funding sources like the National Science Foundation. Other times we get more on sort of the social, charismatic, endangered species side of things from sources like, the National Geographic Society or Disney Foundation. We also have gotten some private donations, and as I'll share with you guys later on, more recently we've opened a field station that is now receiving study abroad courses and researchers and students, and we have already been and hope to continue generating income from that. So what is it that the community engaged research looks like? It consists of these components, which I've talked to you guys about. I've already mentioned these a couple of times. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and mention each of these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the research that we actually conduct, we have sort of 4 main lines of research that we do. And I'll kind of walk you through each of those one by one. One of them is research on endangered species. Like I mentioned before, there's really a huge amount of amazing and almost completely unstudied, or at least understudied, endangered species that are in this area. Here's a couple of them right here. One is the long-wattled umbrella bird. This is a low-light situation, but I hope that you can see. Here's a male who's displaying to a female. It has a long wattle, which is shown here. That's a fleshy appendage that hangs from its body with a bunch of feathers on it that it uses to impress the ladies. And it also has a crest of feathers right here, which sort of resembles like those funny little umbrella hats that some people wear when it's raining outside. So, some of the work that we've done with this species, we found the first nest for the species that was ever recorded for science. We've radio tracked it to identify what its home range requirements and habitat requirements are. How often does it leave primary forest to go into more, more impacted or changed habitat types? We've also, gotten information on its diet and its density and where it's found and stuff like that, basic information that helps to generate conservation planning. And we've done similar work for other species, and other species that we've gathered those same types of data on is this guy right here, the banded ground cuckoo, which is another species endemic to this area, in danger of extinction. And it's an interesting species because one of its closest relatives is actually the roadrunner that we have here in the United States. So it's a purely terrestrial species that just runs around through the forest without really even being able to fly. One thing that I found really amazing on it when we started radio tracking it is that these individuals will leave the nest, jump down on the forest floor, and go forage a distance up to 1 kilometer away from the nest before coming back to bring some food to the kids. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever walked around through the rainforest and maybe you found yourself off of a trail in the rainforest. Has anybody had that experience? It's very easy to get lost in the rainforest. And I mean, I'm just imagining, what it's like to be a bird running around about 4 inches up off the ground and being able to have in your mind a map that allows you to go, cover an area that's 50 hectares in size, what their home range is. It's something that's pretty amazing at these guys. So, we gather basic information on endangered species or species that are just poorly studied or of interest. This is just a couple examples. A second line of research that we have has to do with forest dynamics. And in particular, how is it that animals are moving the pollen and the seeds of plants around? So, many rainforest plants depend upon animals to move their pollen and seeds. Without that, the plants can't move, obviously. So to reproduce and then also to, colonize new areas or give their seedlings a chance for survival, they rely on animals to move them. So we look at species like the long-wattled umbrella bird, which is a big fruit-eating bird, one of the few species that's capable of eating large-seeded fruits, like members of the palm family that's shown here, or the avocado family, and dispersing those seeds around. And we ask questions, how is it that, what are the factors that affect the movement of these animals, and how is it that that affects the dispersal that they provide for these seeds, and how does that in turn affect, sort of the distribution of where these seeds are found, and the probability that a given seedling is going to survive or die. And that's one of the questions that I'm going to dig into in more detail, both for seed dispersal and for pollen in my talk tomorrow. A third angle that we use is just looking at basic patterns of diversity. So we look at how is it that, that natural environmental variables, things like, say, elevation or rainfall, affect patterns of diversity in different groups, ranging from insects like these orchid bees found here, soil, microbial communities, all the way up through birds and primates and mammals. So why, sort of broad spectrum taxonomic studies of, what are the factors, both environmental and also human-based human cause that are affecting these patterns of diversity. And, more recently, but something that I'm really interested in, is looking at these couplings between human and natural systems. It's short for interactions, because I kind of fit it there. So how, what are the factors that determine why it is that humans that live in this area are going to maintain forests on their land or cut it down? Is it, how much does it have to do with market access or culture or, other factors like that? And then not only how does that affect, patterns of diversity and sort of ecological and ecosystem function, but also how does it affect the well-being of the local residents that live there through their diet, through their nutritional health, through the thermal environment that they encounter when they're out working on their land, and how that affects processes like, or traits like, dehydration, as well as sort of economic status and self-perceived metrics of happiness. So that's an area that we're really digging into here. And what you can see here is a map of our general study area. I'll come back to this in a minute. And each of these represents a 1 kilometer long transect that we've established that really run from, the most intervened areas that are just like straight up pasture with no forest around, through to some of the best forested areas in the area. And asking questions about, what is the land cover there? How is that affecting both the human and natural systems? So like I mentioned before, the research acts as a vehicle in many ways for local capacity building and alternative livelihoods. So we have local residents that we hire on to work in a full-time capacity as researchers. And I want to make it really clear that we hear sometimes people talking about, oh, my field technicians, oh, my parabiologists, my assistants. And I want to make it clear that in the system that we have here, these individuals are much more than that. They're collaborators. They're full equals in the research process. Me, as a PhD level researcher, I bring certain skills and knowledges to the project. But similarly, they do as well. And this goes beyond just like, oh, they know that tree and this tree, and they know the forest really well and stuff like that. Some of these individuals have worked for about 15 years in the project, more. And during that time, they've developed as scientists to the point where many of the papers that we publish are oftentimes testing predictions and hypotheses that these people have come up with. They're the ones who are not just kind of going out and gathering the data, and they're not just like knowledgeable about the forest and the things that live in the forest, but they understand the basic ecological concepts that we're looking at, and they're proposing hypotheses, they're proposing methods and study designs to get at them. And we're going out and doing it. And so they have a tremendous impact on the quality of the research that we do, and as a consequence, they're often co-authors on the papers on most of the papers that we put out. Oftentimes, what we try to do is target people that are locally elected leaders, and also people who may have been having a livelihood from hunting or deforestation or something like that, to really maximize the impact that we have through this process. Some of them have maintained themselves in the project for, more than 15 years now. Others have left the project to go on and get university degrees, which is really a tremendous accomplishment for people from this area. This guy right here, Fernando Castillo, got a university degree, and now he's actually been accepted to a master's program in Spain, and he's going to be traveling in just a couple months to that. Beto Gonzalez, shown here, is in his late 30s. He's a father of 3 kids, and he stopped going to school when he was 8 years old, like most of the kids in the area. He's just now taken the decision to go back to high school and complete his sort of GED, which is going to take a couple years. And Domingo Cabrera, shown here, did exactly the same thing, and he was elected the high school class president 3 years in a row. So it's had a transformative effect on the lives of these individuals. And at the same time, we do We do capacity building at other levels too. We work with people who already have university degrees, who are from the capital city, say, something like that, who are filling more leadership positions, or at least administrative positions within the foundation. The research also acts as a vehicle for education in local communities. So these same environmental ambassadors, the local residents that are full-time employees, have a big chunk of their time where they go around to local communities and they present on their work. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are we finding out? What are the implications for you as my neighbor for that? You know, how is it going to affect you if you cut down all your forests? What's that going to do to the watersheds in your area, or to the, you know, pollination services that you might be getting for your crops, things like that. We also put on more technical workshops where we bring in people to give workshops on things like sustainable cacao management, or you know, trash management, or hygiene, basic health, or other needs that community members have identified. We put on annual environmental fairs that attract about 1,000 people per year, and there's, you know, contests and activities related around the environment. And then also for about 8 years, we work through the local schools, training teachers to incorporate environmental information into their teaching sort of workflow, and provide them with teaching aids and stuff like that to make that happen. So that's what we do on the local level. And then we also have a big component of working with both Ecuadorian and US students. So I hope that you guys perk up your ears a little bit here, because I'm talking specifically to you guys, saying that there's an opportunity to come down here and work within the context of this project. For undergraduate research, we've had you know, dozens of honors thesis projects that have come out of this, and several times that students who've come down for weeks or a few months at a time to be engaged in this research program that we have. There's excellent opportunities for it. You don't need to speak Spanish, because the people that we work with have pretty good experience now communicating with non-Spanish speakers, and it can really be a win-win sort of situation. Similarly, at the PhD and master's level, there's opportunities for that. And then there's also study abroad courses, both ones that we offer ourselves, but that are open to students from outside of Tulane, as well as just trying to drum up business by professors from other universities like Tufts here to potentially bring students. So we've had some wins in this project. We've published a lot of papers. We've gotten pretty good funding and grants, and we've gotten a number of different awards that sort of recognize achievement in conservation. And I'll just say briefly, talking about a model of community-engaged research and how this actually works, especially for those of you who are thinking about pursuing a career in academia, it can be a real challenge to do community-engaged research, because on the one hand, you know, universities pay a lot of lip service to having real-world impacts. I think every single university has information where they say, you know, we're making a difference. But if you're a professor at a university, there's one major sort of hurdle that you have to get over if you want to actually be able to have a career as a professor, and that's the promotion and tenure, or a tenure and promotion decision, where generally what you get is a bunch of old, oftentimes white guys sitting around in a room looking at your case and asking, has this person been productive enough from the traditional scholarship metrics to warrant getting tenure in the university? And at that point, you either get a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And in many cases, there can be a tension between having real-world engaged impacts and getting tenure. So what I do want to say is that in my particular case, I've been fortunate to be able to develop a model where the one hand really feeds the other, in the sense that the research is a vehicle for a lot of the activities that I've talked about, and I'm going to give you guys one more specific kind of case study that I'm going to unpack a little bit. But at the same time, it's also a vehicle to you know, sort of realize these real-world impacts, so that, you know, I lived in Ecuador for 5 or 6 years between when I got my PhD and when I got a faculty job. And that was a time when I was able to develop these relationships with local people, relationships of trust, that have really allowed me to implement this sort of project. But I don't mean to make it seem like, oh, you can just kind of pick this up off the shelf. It does take time to develop projects like this. And I think ultimately, to be successful in it, what it really requires is identifying individuals in the community or the context where you want to work that are motivated and capable of affecting change themselves, so that you find yourself in a role of really just sort of empowering those individuals in a collaborative and supportive kind of way. And I've been really lucky to find people like that in this area who are really taking the ball and running with it. People like, this guy right here, Jorge Olivo, who is the winner of a couple of these different awards. And he's somebody who just, he lives there, he grew up there, his kids are there. He wants to see conservation happen in this area. He gets it. And a lot of what I do is just giving him the resources and the support that he needs to make it happen. And similarly with the other people I work with. So I want to talk about one particular study that we've done to kind of show how this works in the real world. This is a view of the Machichindoul Reserve. You can see right here where this square is taken out of, with the green area here being the Machichindoul Reserve. So it's a pretty small area of the Machichindoul Reserve. And there's a few things that I want to highlight for you as you look at this image. First of all, you can't really see where the reserve starts and where it ends. There's no clear boundary of where the Machichindoul Reserve is. That speaks to some of the issues I was talking about at the top of the talk in terms of the challenges associated with enforcement. The Ministry of the Environment is understaffed and under-resourced to be able to manage an area like this. The dark green colors here represent standing forest. The light green colors represent land that's been cleared largely for pasture or some short cycle crops. This area right here, outlined in red, is Bilsa Biological Station. It's a large area. It's the largest intact area of forest anywhere around here that you can see on this map. And it's owned and operated by another NGO that works in Ecuador called the Hatun Sacha Foundation. So for many years, we did research in this area. We have this one area, kind of like what I'm mapping in green here, that is a long-term study parcel for us. And for many years, we worked out of this area. This is where we did our scientific research, and then we would go out to the communities to do our engagement work and our education work. But over time, we realized that there are all these little patches of forest out there. They're called forest fragments, is the word that I'm going to use to describe these isolated pieces of forest that are surrounded by an agricultural landscape or matrix. And we noticed that, there's a lot of forest out there. It's getting cut. We have no idea what's in those fragments. It's all on private land, quote-unquote private land, because there's issues with land tenure in this area. So it's all on private land. And we don't know if are they meaningless for conservation? Are they critically valuable for conservation? We just don't know. So we came up in about 2014-15, we came up with a project to go sample those fragments. So what we did is we went out, we identified, depending on the taxa that we studied, somewhere between 25 and 45 different forest fragments. And for each one, we walked the boundary of the fragment to map its boundaries, or its borders. And we selected ones to sort of maximize the gradient of elevation and distance from this large reserve Bilsa here. And then we went out there and we started to sample them. And the way that we put things together to sample them is that we came up with a big team that was composed of local residents, like here's Jorge, shown again here, here's Beto, and other local residents. And we combined, I was able to get some funding for this project. And I went out to the universities and the NGOs in Ecuador, and I identified young Ecuadorians who were just coming back to Ecuador with PhDs in hand. And I said to them, we've got the infrastructure to go out and sample these fragments. And I will fund, an honors thesis student of yours or a master's student of yours. And I'll fund a local resident to pair with that individual. And we can go out and we'll study these fragments and we'll sample them for fill in the blank, your species of choice. Like, what do you like? You You like beetles, you like soil microbes, you like amphibians. Okay, we'll go study those. And then, your student can be the lead author, you can be the lead author. It's something that will benefit you as a faculty member. It's something that will benefit the student. It'll promote sort of student local resident interchange. And it'll benefit, the basic project and our information about the area. So we implemented this project. This team, plus a few other people, they traveled around to different communities. And each time, like when they sampled these fragments, we would find a house, sometimes abandoned. Sometimes we just paid people to move out of it for like a month. And we would just move in there en masse. We had a couple of cooks, and we had 20-odd people there. And we would identify these fragments, and we would set up these sampling regimes, and then we would just go out and sample the fragments in the area for about 25 days. Then there'd be about 10 days of rest. Then we would go, to the next community and sample that one, and so on. So it was very challenging logistically to do this work. It was exhausting for these people. But, they did it. They did a great job. And at the end of the day, we were able to sample these fragments for a really broad range of taxa. And also not just taxa, but we did some stuff related to ecological processes, and then we also delved a little bit into some of the human-natural interactions. This was about 5 years ago. From talking again about that tension that sometimes exists between academic sort of scholarly performance and on-the-ground impacts, the reason I'm choosing to illustrate this is because I think it does a particularly good job of illustrating how those two things can merge. Here's a list of the publications that we put out so far from this. A lot of these have, Ecuadorian or, either PI or student first authors or graduate student first authors. We're continuing to put out the findings. Here's a picture of one of our local residents, Domingo, presenting his results at an international scientific meeting. It's kind of ticking that box. We're making the people who care about publications happy. We're generating basic knowledge about this, chronically understudied area. I will say one thing that's pretty cool about this is that there's not a lot of studies that have been able to look at the sort of meta-level trends across such a broad range of taxa. So there's plenty of studies that are out there on birds or mammals or whatever, but there's not that many studies that have looked at such a broad spectrum of different types of animals and seen what sort of trends extend. What are the commonalities? What are the differences? Why those might exist? And I'll just say the one thing that's really coming out, which is kind of surprising to me, is that a major driver, the strongest driver for many of these groups is the amount of surrounding forest cover in the agricultural matrix. It has relatively little to do with the attributes of the particular fragment. How big is it? What kind of forest is it? It has more to do with what the surrounding context is like. But at the same time, what this information allowed us to do is it allowed us to actually say, there's certain specific fragments that are out there that are really high priorities for conservation. And one of them is this one right here. It contains a critically endangered primate. It contains, this is the banded ground cuckoo, which is endangered at a global level, and also the umbrella bird, which is vulnerable. It contains a number of other endangered and vulnerable species as well. And what we were able to do is use that information that we gathered through this work to write a grant proposal to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a program that's called the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act program. And it basically provides funding for the conservation of neotropical birds. And since neotropical birds overwinter in places like this, we were able to use this information, in addition to information about the birds that are found there, to successfully argue that they give us the money to buy this land for conservation. So we did that. Just this past year, we were able to purchase this land and establish this reserve, which is about 2/3 of the size of Central Park in New York. So that was a really exciting development and sort of a new level for us as a foundation. And starting earlier this year, we were able to construct a field station. So shown here is the dining area and an observation deck, and then Here's one dorm here. There's another dorm here. There's room for about 50 visitors. We had a group of students come from Tulane earlier this year for a tropical field biology course, and it was a great success. And we also have PhD level researchers and undergrad researchers that are coming down to the site and already doing some work there. So it's up and running, which is exciting for us. And our vision for the future is twofold. One is to acquire more land through land purchase. And we have sort of two phases for that. The first is to purchase the forest that's immediately surrounding our reserve. So this tract, this little bit right here that's not outlined, and these properties, which will end up sort of tripling the size of our reserve. And we see that as sort of a first expansion and consolidation phase. The reason that we're prioritizing that is because the deforestation rates are just so high right now that standing forest is of exceptional value. And we're acting as fast as we can to purchase that. So our goal, we have proposals and we have pending and we have conversations with individual donors. And our goal is that a year from now that we will have acquired these properties that are shown here. The second phase, which we hope to do soon after that, is to get some connectivity. So here's Bilsa Biological Station. Shown over here is a rainforest lake that's a globally recognized wetland priority. It's not very common that you find lakes in a rainforest area, and this one supports a lot of wildlife, and it also is really important for the human population there. So our goal in the next 3 to 5 years is to acquire this patch of land right here, and to acquire this land right here, to basically be able to have a corridor that connects this large reserve Bilsa through to the lake. And we feel like that's an achievable goal. The price tag on it is about $1.25 million. And that price tag includes, for the land purchase. And then there's another $750,000 that we're going to be trying to raise. And what we're going to do with that is to try to increase capacity of local residents to benefit from nature-based ecotourism in this area. So lodges, guiding, handicrafts, food, whatever it ends up being, tours, to try to basically catalyze a local economy around the forest resources, the lake, the forest that we're seeking to conserve. And one thing that's both sort of terrifying but also timely is that the infrastructure in Ecuador is really rapidly developing. And this area, one of the reasons that there's still forest in this area is that the road system was just so terrible that people really couldn't get in there, and they couldn't get goods out to market either. But now, this year, they're planning on paving a road to come all the way into here. So there's going to be paved road to here in just a few months' time. And that's, both a real challenge for conservation for reasons that I'm sure that you're all aware of, but it's also an opportunity for, people being able to make it to this area, both for local tourism and also international tourism. So that's our vision over the long term. And I just want to close by extending an invitation. This is something I mentioned before in the talk, but I want to just come back to it really briefly, is that we have a lot of experience working with students from the United States on this project. And in nearly all the cases, it ends up being a real sort of win-win experience. So how could you get involved in this? One is we offer a 2-week upper division course in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department at Tulane. It's called Tropical Biology and Conservation. And it's open to students from other universities. And I think there would probably be a petition process, but it's something that could potentially count for your majors. We also have, over 100 students that have come over the summer and done research. In some cases, they've just wanted to get research experience, and they've sort of worked with the team. In other cases, they've come down with a more specific idea about, I want to do this project. And we've helped them to implement that project. There's also, in terms of conservation, there's opportunities for involvement with some of the education and outreach, injecting arts into the program, other aspects like that, that we've had students have successful experiences with. In terms of research, we are developing, like I mentioned before, a real strong emphasis on not just sort of natural ecological questions, but also the human component of it. And we have a real interest in forming bridges with people working in the social sciences and public health. And I will say for anybody who's working in that discipline, that one benefit that we have here is that we have really strong existing relationships with the local communities and the local residents that leads to, access to, being able to ask the sorts of questions and get access to the sort of people that you might need for studies like that. And then finally, part of this that I've alluded to, but just to talk about it, is that, we've been running continuously for over 15 years now as a foundation. And during that time in Ecuador, there's been other foundations that have blinked on and blinked off. It's been challenging to maintain as an NGO, and there's people working on this project who have, left whatever they were doing before and committed their lives to this trajectory of research and conservation. And until now, we've really relied almost exclusively on grants to fund that work. And that's challenging, because grants typically have short durations, a year, 2 years, 3 years. And, so there's always this sort of horizon that's out there. The one difference, I will say, the one exception to that I do want to give a shout out to, again, is actually the Disney Foundation, who's funded us 17 consecutive years in a row, which has been huge for us. But, we do see, this sort of visitation and involvement, and with people coming to the station and paying to spend the nights there as a source of sustainability for the efforts that we have, both in terms of maintaining our operations and potentially in terms of, expanding through land purchase or more conservation-based activities. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop up. I hope that there's time for a little bit of questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jordan. That was wonderful. I have a couple of questions. I just want to know which was the extinct or the nearly extinct primate. Was that a capuchin monkey that I saw?
It was, yeah. There's an endemic species, the Ecuadorian capuchin, it's called.
Yeah, I used to work with them. I love them. But my bigger question is, what kind of buy-in do you get from the people who are native to the area, and how difficult? I mean, you're talking about a major life change for them. How difficult was it to make inroads?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the question had to do with, what kind of buy-in do we get? What challenges do we face with that? And, there's a bunch of different considerations there. One is that the communities, the people who live there are poor. They do not have, they're lacking money, and they're also lacking basic services, including education for their children, which is in many cases, the most or one of the most important things for them is being able to provide educational opportunities for their children. So for us, being able to offer full-time employment is a big deal. So we have, many more people that would like to come work for us than we can offer employment to, which is a bottleneck for us. But the other thing that we've been able to offer is improving the educational opportunities through this program that I alluded to in the schools in particular, and other activities that we do. So, we've had a mixed record in terms of, it's not like every single person says, oh, I love the environment now, I want to do this. There's people who are still hunting. There's people who are still deforesting. There's people who come and, vandalize our equipment out in the field. But at the same time, a huge consideration is that the people that are the face of this project are local residents themselves, who are almost universally well-respected and well-known people from the zone, who grew up in the zone, who have a long-term presence there. So that's been absolutely critical. The combination of those things has been absolutely critical in terms of being able to win the hearts and the minds of most of the people in the area. Not all of them, but most of them. But I will just say that one other general thing about doing this kind of work is being really careful about what you promise people and the sorts of expectations that you raise in the people. Being careful to not overpromise or raise expectations about something that when you don't do it, they feel like they've been taken advantage of, sort of. So that, we're working along those lines. And we feel like there's good opportunities with the vision that we talked about, but we'll have to see how it goes.
I have a quick question. So your role has sort of evolved from living there for 5-6 years to now being a professor at Tulane with 7 grad students with 2 young kids making travel. How has your role evolved over the time of this work that has made it more local?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that more in your class later on today. But what I will say is that when I went down there, I had recently got my PhD. I studied a really common species of bird in Australia. The work was cool, but it didn't really have any conservation implications, to be fair. And I was like, I want to make a difference with my life. It's not enough for me to just do the research. So I went down to Ecuador, and I was like, I'm going to light the world. I'm going to make a difference here, So I just didn't know how to do it, really, So I used this model that I was familiar with, bringing U.S.-based students down there exclusively to do the work, like not really integrating with local communities. And it took a little bit of time for it to evolve. But once I was really fortunate that the 2 people I started working with from the local communities, Jorge Olivo and Domingo Cabrera, are just both exceptional people and leaders. And, it very quickly became obvious that my role then, like, really clearly got designated to a few things, and that they were kind of doing the rest, And it's really just sort of gone on from there. Yeah.
One last question.
Hi. So you have pretty ambitious plans for the future in terms of acquiring more land. Hope you reach it. But as you're going through that process, how are you guys making those land use policy decisions? And do you have to kind of jump through any loops with the local government in order to do that? Or what kind of challenges are you facing, if any, aside from funding? Obviously.
Well, the funding is a big challenge. When the first grant, the grant that we got from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was a tremendous challenge logistically to be able to spend that money down, because the grant was made to Tulane University, but FCAT is the entity that purchased it and owns it. So there was all kinds of administrative issues there. But in broad stroke terms, the land purchases, the main issue with land purchase that's challenging there is that some people have clear title to the land. Other people have what's called possessory rights, which is kind of like squatters' rights. It's not really the same as legal title. So you find yourself in a situation where you're buying land. You're not really buying the title to that land. You're just buying the rights to squat on it, but there may be somebody else that actually owns it. So there's issues associated with that. But beyond that, it's a pretty straightforward legal process for land purchase. Our goal with that is to get enough, right now there's enough forest there that the areas that you see that are still in pasture, there's enough animals and seeds and stuff to reforest that naturally. But, we feel like we're at sort of getting close to a critical tipping point where there's not going to be enough forest there to do that. So our goal is to kind of lock up enough forest in the central area there to be able to really maintain the integrity of the area. Yeah.
Well, Jordan, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody.
If anybody would like to ask Jordan any questions in the follow-up, he'll be happy to stay up front and answer your questions. And just a reminder, if everybody could stack a chair, you can take your chair back, but you could also make stacks of how many, Ivara? Make stacks of 5, and we will move them around with the whatever you call it, the chair mover. Thank you.